Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Oceans of Insight. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that's as vast as the waters we're discussing: the maritime interests of African nations and how their unique geographical positioning influences global ocean governance. I'm your host, Felix Simmons, and joining me today is Dr. Miriam Kante, an expert in maritime law and African geopolitics. Welcome, Miriam.
Thank you, Felix. I'm excited to be here and to discuss something so vital yet often overlooked: the strategic role that African countries play in shaping international maritime policies.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. Africa stands at a critical crossroads of major oceanic trade routes, doesn't it? Especially with the Cape route linking East Africa and the Gulf and the Suez Canal corridor. It's like the continent is the center of a grand maritime highway.
Exactly. This geographical advantage gives African states not just a voice, but a stake in international ocean governance. Their participation in the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS III, marked a paradigm shift, especially for developing nations. They were no longer just bystanders. They were actively involved in shaping laws that govern ocean resources.
That's a significant point, Miriam. We've seen historical patterns where colonial powers exploited African marine resources under the guise of the freedom of the high seas. It's disheartening to think about how more than 60% of fish stocks were harvested by foreign fleets during that time, essentially draining the continent's wealth.
Right. The legacy of colonialism has left deep scars, impacting both marine life and coastal communities. The freedom of the high seas doctrine, which was originally established to encourage exploration and trade, has often served to facilitate exploitation rather than equitable resource sharing. How ironic is that? In many ways, it's akin to the opening scene of a heist film, where the locals get robbed while the thieves split the loot.
That's a vivid analogy. Shift gears with me for a moment, though. It's also interesting to note the tensions between coastal and landlocked African states. On one hand, you have coastal nations fiercely protecting their exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, while on the other hand, landlocked nations advocate for regional resource sharing agreements. It's like a complex game of tug of war.
Yes, and that complexity can lead to fraught negotiations. Landlocked nations have pushed for participation rights in coastal states' EEZs, as well as regional exclusive economic zones open to all. But this often meets resistance from coastal countries. It's an intricate balance of interests, very reminiscent of family dynamics during holiday dinners. Everyone wants their piece of the pie, but not everyone can agree on how to slice it.
I love that comparison. And speaking of balancing interests, the discussions around the exclusive economic zone itself have evolved from traditional maritime law. It now encapsulates a 200-mile limit surrounding coastal states, which was largely championed by African nations. This was their way of asserting sovereignty over marine resources.
Absolutely. This 200-mile limit can be thought of as a buffer zone, a kind of maritime fence that gives coastal countries exclusive rights to exploit the resources within. But what's truly fascinating is that while the concept began in Latin America, African states were instrumental in refining and advocating for it. They gathered scientific evidence from respected organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization to back their claims.
And if I understand correctly, this limit is not just a straightforward number. It's rooted in ecological justifications that cover most living marine resources found within continental shelves, while also acknowledging that certain highly migratory species like tuna and whales don't abide by these boundaries.
Spot on. And with that, we touch on the need for international protocols to manage those migratory species. They don't recognize the lines drawn by politicians. They follow the currents of the ocean. This calls for a level of cooperation that transcends individual state interests.
So we're talking about a necessary shift toward integrated resource management. Can you give us an example of how this might work in practice?
Sure. Let's consider a case involving a fish species like tuna, which migrates across various EEZs. African countries would need to form cooperative agreements that allow for joint fishing ventures that are sustainable and equitable. It's like teamwork on a giant soccer field. Everyone has to play together to win.
So where do we go from here? How do we create an environment where both coastal and landlocked states can benefit from the ocean's resources? Or is this just another example of competing interests leading to stalemates?
This is where innovative solutions come into play. For instance, advocating for joint ventures and regional integration movements can serve as quality alternatives to contentious unilateral approaches. Organizations like the West African Economic Community, which includes many landlocked nations, are pushing the envelope on collaboration.
Innovation and collaboration, two words that emerge often in discussions on resource management. This reminds me of technological advancements in protein extraction from unconventional sources, like phytoplankton. It's a burgeoning frontier, but I'd imagine it requires preemptive regulatory frameworks to ensure resources are harnessed sustainably.
Exactly. And therein lies another challenge. Many African states lack the technological capacity to develop commercial fishing industries. So instead of diving into a competitive market, wouldn't it make more sense for them to advocate for international support in high seas resource exploration?
That's a smart approach. And now let's pivot to a distinct facet of marine resource management: the exploitation of non-living resources like hydrocarbons on the continental shelf. We've seen negotiations around these resources create a distinct dynamic separate from living resources, haven't we?
Absolutely. Here, we see a fierce battle for rights, especially when landlocked states raise concerns over access to continental margin resources. For instance, proposals that grant them access to mineral exploitation spark a lot of contention among coastal nations. It's reminiscent of siblings clamoring for the last piece of cake, isn't it?
Very much so. And to compound matters, the ongoing question about what happens when resources become depleted due to mismanagement looms large. Would coastal states retain access rights, or would equitable frameworks need to adapt?
It's a complex web indeed. Clear legal frameworks are essential for addressing conflicts over marine boundaries, especially with overlapping claims. This means effective conflict resolution mechanisms become paramount.
As we explore boundaries further, African nations have also advocated for the non-recognition of EEZs claimed by foreign authorities over colonized territories. This is a bold stance that aligns the struggle for resource rights with broader anti-colonial movements.
Right. Such positions view historical exploitation as a push for restitution. A poignant example is the case of the Banabon inhabitants of Ocean Island, who faced displacement and environmental devastation due to phosphate mining. Their story serves as a stark reminder of the long-term implications of exploitation.
And the United Nations General Assembly recognized this struggle by adopting Resolution 3201, which affirms the rights of colonized territories. It's an enormous step towards acknowledging the wrongs of the past.
Exactly. In essence, the principle emerges that resources should serve the benefit of indigenous peoples rather than foreign interests. This pushes forward narratives of resource sovereignty in post-colonial contexts, aligning with modern global calls for justice.
As we wrap up today, it's clear that the topic of African maritime interests is not merely academic. It's a living dialogue that shapes the continent's future. From asserting rights over EEZs and combating colonial legacies to transcending boundaries in resource management, these issues are interconnected and vital.
That's beautifully stated, Felix. We're witnessing a transformation in how Africa interacts with its maritime realm, effectively rewriting the narrative around freedom of the high seas and collective resource management. Let's keep this conversation going, as the stakes are high and the potential transformative.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us today for this enlightening conversation about Africa's maritime strategies and geopolitical intricacies. We encourage our listeners to delve deeper into these issues and think about how they relate to global maritime laws. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the oceans of knowledge.